All right, so I'll
Victor, I'm
hop
gonna
into
kick
it.
it over to you. You can just jump right in. I'm gonna make you the host.
Awesome. Can you guys see the slide that I'm sharing?
No,
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can.
I can't. What?
Yeah, I can. Yep.
Now I can see it.
Okay, right on. Yeah, hopping right into it. I'm going to start with a bit of a tangent, but to contextualize it, I like to start with talking a little bit about Irish Red. If you're not familiar with Irish Red, the BJCP defines it as an easy drinking pint, often with subtle flavors. You know, that's a less pejorative way to say bland, right? Slightly malty in the balance, touch of roasted dryness, which is a key feature for the style, characteristic note. But yeah, overall, it's got to be light, easy drinking, and sessionable. And while the BJCP is making pains in the history section to point out that, of course, Ireland has a long brewing heritage, the modern phenomenon of Irish Red Ale is essentially an interpretation of English bitter with less hopping and a bit of roast barley, which adds color and dryness and a distinctive kind of color and character as opposed to a red ale made with caramel malt. That said, the BJCP allows caramel in an Irish Red, and it's a very broad style. Rediscovered or reinvented as a craft beer style in Ireland, it is a very common part of many Irish brewery lineups, along with some kind of stout, of course. This is from Irish Craft Beer, a blog, and the author writes, when Michael Jackson came over and wrote about Irish beer, he found a country with stout, lager, pardon me, and bland red beer, which he called Irish Red. He gave it that moniker, right? That was a name that he dubbed it in the same way that we don't call it, you know, Canadian bacon, right? It was a name brought in from the outside. No one had called it that before Smithwick's, which I'm actually, by coincidence, not drinking, but drinking the glass. The most common example was simply called ale. According to the author, this was a disaster for beer in Ireland. Michael Jackson, the beer hunter, had given these bland, flavorless beers the legitimacy of their own style name. And so there was a felt obligation among Irish micros to make one. The fact that it's not truly a domestic beer style, but an interpretation of a popular English style. I mean, that's also true of dry Irish stout, which is ultimately traced back to English porter, which was the ubiquitous beer style of the day. So it's a little bit like if American light lager stopped being such a thing in America and the last surviving major producer of it was Canadian. And so several hundred years later, people started calling it Canadian light lager, right? But that's, I digress. That's another style point on, not related to this. I got to stay focused. The point is, Michael Jackson had given Irish brewers a style, and damn it, the Irish micros were going to brew it. And of course, the BJCP picked up a lot on where Michael Jackson left off, or at least used his work as essentially the foundation, and has done its part to reinforce this. So the point I'm trying to make here is I'm not anti-Irish Red. In fact, I quite enjoy Irish Red Ale. My point is just there's a simple feedback loop at play here in the beer world where someone like Michael Jackson, recognizing his style, giving it the legitimacy of a name, helps raise awareness. The Irish micros brew it, and that feeds back into further recognition. The whole time this cycle goes around and around and around, that style is building legitimacy. And so most in the brewing world would probably agree that Irish Red is a thing. Now, this is despite the fact it's a red ale, like so many others, right? With maybe the roast barley to color and a touch of dryness in the finish being a point of differentiation. As for the BJCP's part, they're aware of their impact, and again, they take pains in the most current version of the guidelines to point out that they don't use country or region names to imply ownership or any other kind of preferential standing. They try and use names that are in common usage, and they know that these names can bring along political, ethnic, or social conflict. They officially are neutral. They are simply trying to describe beer as it exists in the world, not settle or create disputes. They also are very much aware of the impact of their own guidelines. They write, when we created the previous versions, they were not aware. They had no idea how prevalent and pervasive they would become, simply trying to create a set of standardized style definitions so they could facilitate homebrew competitions, but found that they were adopted worldwide, describing beer in general. Many countries, especially with emerging craft beer markets, were using them, just like Michael Jackson's works before, as a kind of Bible, as a kind of playbook for what to brew. I don't know about you guys in this meeting, but I know for myself at least, I've definitely found inspiration in the guidelines, flipping through, picking a style. Let's brew that, right? Consumers and trade groups began using these guidelines to help describe their products. So imagine for a moment an alternate history where Michael Jackson visits Canada and finds today Rickard's Red and Alexander Keith's Amber Ale and Laker Red for those in Ontario, or even President's Choice dealcoholized red brew, right? Similarly, he might lump these kind of products together into Canadian red ale or a maple red ale, probably, most likely. And then, you know, the craft would add maple syrup to it. And then like Scotch ale, purists would say, there's no smoke, there's no peat smoke in there. Kentucky Common is not a sour mash. Anyway, where would these styles go? Where would Rickard Red go? Where would Keith's Amber? Most people would probably put them under International Amber, which is an umbrella category of mass market amber lagers, either developed independently or describing rather generic amber beers that may have been a more historically significant style. The one that they normally talk about is Vienna lager, but have been watered down, have been made more appealing to a mass market, and essentially through a coevolution have become this rather indistinguishable product in modern time. In terms of history, it varies by country, but generally represents an adaptation of mass market international lager, a coloring up of a pale, easy drinking lager, or a watering down of some sort of indigenous style into a more generic product. And that is the case with the classic example of Dos Equis, which was at one time a respected Vienna lager. Interestingly enough, throwing a bit of shade at Brooklyn Brewery, they had now included Brooklyn Lager in that category of international amber. I disagree with this, not because I think it's a great example of a Vienna, but if you've had it lately, you know they've reformulated it, and it's a pale ale. It's an American pale. It's good, but as they describe it themselves, it's full of grapefruit, flowers, and pine. It was at one point very much like a Vienna lager. It then became more like an international amber, and now it's an American pale ale. Styles and individual products are their culture. They evolve, they change. Any case, Vienna lager. What about Vienna lager? Well, this is one of the interesting styles in the guidelines that has been earmarked as being on the watch list, not for extinction, but for move to the historical category to allow the classic style to be described while moving the sweeter, modern, adjunct heavy kind of products to the international amber or dark, depending on where they fall on the color spectrum. So, again, I personally am not arguing against Irish Red. But the argument that some will make, especially after discussing these kind of reds, is that, okay, Irish red, that's clearly just an international amber. It's an evolution of English bitter into a more generic amber, easy drinking, subtle pint, just like the Vienna lager into Dos Equis. So should we collapse it into international amber, or does the precedent of Irish red ale means that we should create some sort of Mexican cerveza ambar to cover these kind of new products? Or should we completely wipe out the idea of cultural context and national conditions and only lump beers together by final flavor profile? If they taste similar, regardless of their history, their region of origin, their individual process or ingredients, if they end up in a similar realm in terms of flavor profile, do we just throw them all together? I'm not arguing for one or the other. I don't have a good answer for this. I don't think there can be any easy answers for what defines relevance for these styles. But certainly I don't think the BJCP does either. And there are contradictions throughout the guidelines. Two other quick ambers to consider: the Czech amber lager, a style, according to the BJCP, that can be similar to Vienna lager, but with Sauser type hop character. If you're familiar with Vienna lager, then you know Sauser type hop character is totally appropriate in Vienna. Or perhaps like an English bitter, but significantly richer with a bit more deep caramel character. While large brewery versions are essentially colored up versions of a Czech lager with slightly darker malt flavors and less hop. Alt beer is a well-known style, but it emerges from one town in one country, and not even that, but one small part of that town, the Altstadt, the old town of Dusseldorf. And the Old Style Guidelines, for those of you who studied those, the Old Testament, will remember that there used to be two versions of Alt beer, and the BJCP and the updates have reduced it down to one. Nevertheless, I'm willing to bet, even though we have people logging in from across our country, that you have probably tried a beer brewed in the style of the old town of Dusseldorf, which is, when I think about that, a wonderful idiosyncratic thing that, you know, people across Canada have tried beers brewed in the style of the old town of Dusseldorf. And the reason why I'm confident in this is because I know that breweries across our country are making fruit beer. Wherever you are, old breweries, new breweries, small breweries, tiny breweries, major breweries, breweries on breweries on breweries making oat beer. Now, I'm not against oat beer, but I think it is important to remember that oat beer itself is not actually that not actually that old. It is a response to the popularity of lager style beers. And it's everywhere. It's everywhere across Canada. We are inspired to brew a lot of oat. Now, the reasons for that are probably complicated, but I would argue that at least part of it is the impact of recognition by the BJCP and people before, like Michael Jackson. How often have you had an old beer? That, I mean, again, it's a small, very regional style, not just one town, but one section of town in one town of Germany. The impact of BJCP recognition, I think, is hard to deny, even if what determines that recognition worthiness is difficult to define. Should it be popularity or prestige, uniqueness or ubiquity, historical significance or current interest, local relevance or international recognition, stylistic coherence and fidelity over time, or resilience and adaptability? Frustratingly, when considering the legitimacy of Canadian styles, when I have these conversations with other judges, all of the above is used as kind of a moving goalpost to dismiss all of our Canadian styles depending on the style being considered. Roos is too murky, too local of a phenomenon, while ice beer, though it has been since its conception a pretty coherent style sold in consistently impressive volume, it's hopelessly mainstream and only dates back to the 90s. Spruce beer, by comparison, is heavy with historical significance, maybe even a little bit of prestige, but it is far too unpopular in low volume, typically only special releases. And Ontario Pale Ale, man, I have had conversations with beer people who will say, Ontario Pale Ale doesn't exist and I hate it. Right? It's pretty unloved, even by its own creators. Again, this is a kind of negative feedback loop, and oftentimes the argument ends at some sort of version of this. These styles are not worthy of inclusion, or they would already have been included. A kind of circular reasoning that, of course, can also become a self-fulfilled prophecy. Alt beer isn't going anywhere, but if it wasn't recognized early on, I don't think brewers across Canada would be making it. And alternatively, if we had a domestic red style, I think we'd be making it. In any case, the lack of recognition likewise leads to very low awareness, and as that cycle repeats, it erodes legitimacy. So who cares? As that blogger wrote, some Irish brewers don't even like the idea of an Irish red ale. They thought it was a disaster, presumably because they wanted something cooler or more hip to represent Ireland, something trendy at the time of writing. And they got dad beer, right? In the same way that I have had brewers tell me that they would actually be offended if I managed to get Ontario Pale Ale officially recognized. That's not what they want to be known for. So why would we want to define Canadian styles? Why would we seek recognition and chain ourselves to a style like ice beer, or even worse, Ontario Pale Ale? And of course, a lot of people in our beer community don't even like the idea of defining a style to begin with. My argument here is just that recognition is representation. And when I was studying the 2004 edition of the guidelines, it was quite American-centric. A point hammered home while trying to study any style and having to memorize and recite classic examples that were largely American examples or imports available in America, broadly available in America, that I had neither seen nor tasted, had no reference point, right? How easy is it to remember Sleeman's Cream Ale for the cream ale example? At least for us in Ontario, I know that's second nature. You would be forgiven if you studied the BJCP guidelines and came away thinking that the great brewing nations of the world are England and Germany and the Czech Republic and Belgium and America, and, you know, Australian sparkling and New Zealand Pilsner, right? Without that kind of recognition, it's easy for Canadian brewers, especially those getting started, to come to the conclusion that there is no Canadian brewing culture. And I think that's a shame, because there is. Part of that is a cliche, but I do think Canadians tend to suffer from a bit of an inferiority complex, especially regarding our American friends. We don't think of them as being real or having made it until they are met with the approval of the Americans. Any case, if you're wondering what the status of this efforts are, so far it's been about 3 years and counting to have these styles recognized, or at least some of these styles. I have mailed samples of ice beer to review in 2018. I've also requested that representatives from the BJCP visit Canada to, tour Montreal to evaluate roofs, travel the country, see for yourselves. Don't take my word for it, as was done when New Zealand Pilsner and Katharina Sour were being evaluated. A new BJCP update is coming apparently soon, and last I heard, these styles are going to be in them, maybe? But they wouldn't be official styles, they would be under the appendix, unofficial. And they're looking for more data. So is there historical data? Well, no, they were undefined styles, so we don't have numbers to crunch. That doesn't mean there is nothing to look at. Ontario Pale Ale could have been massaged into either American or English Pale Ales, though it isn't really either. The prototypical example, Tank House, took silver in English Pale Ale bitter in the 2006 Canadian Brewing Awards. This was back in the day when Niagara Brewing Co. still existed and was winning awards for its Ice Bock. They took Bock that same year for their 2005 vintage. That used to be one of 3 Canadian brewed classic examples in the old guidelines, now down to just 2. Now, our scene across the country has exploded. It has been years since something like Tank House, which is not really an American IPA or an English Pale Ale, medals in anything, because we have much more high fidelity examples of style, better, more true to style examples that will take gold and silver. But that doesn't mean the style ceased to exist necessarily. Roos is similar. It could be massaged into either American amber or pale or even Irish red, maybe even oat beer. Looking at the prototypical specimen of Roos Boreal, they just don't enter it. They highlight a 2012 bronze medal in a Brussels Beer Challenge. The 2 examples of the style regularly available to me in Ontario are Sleeman Roos, dark in Ontario, and Griffin Roos, or red in Ontario. And again, they're not well represented in competitions either. But given the size and scale of these breweries, not surprising. By coincidence, these 2 breweries happen to be the brewers of the 2 other styles that are still classic Canadian BJCP examples. Sleeman, of course, the cream ale, and McCausland's oatmeal stout. All that said, Glutenberg Roos by Brasur Sans Gluten did medal in the CBAs in 2015, 2017 for their gluten-free version of a Roos, but again, no specific category for Roos existed. Spruce beer, the most famous example I know, is by Garrison, but it hasn't been entered as far as I'm aware. A couple of years back, 2018, I know that Torque out of Manitoba took gold for Borealis, which was effectively a spruce beer entered as a gruit. Not surprising again, given that spruce beer is an undefined style and did not have an entry category. Ice beer, largely macro. I don't know if that'll ever change, but I mean, I didn't think craft brewers would ever make light lager. And I can't even tell you, maybe outside of Ontario, it's not a phenomenon yet, but I've encountered so many craft light lagers. Ice beer remains a macro phenomenon. To my knowledge, never entered in these kind of craft predominant competitions. That said, maybe they would if there was a ice beer category. Even if it isn't entered, that doesn't change the reality that thousands of barrels of ice beer are brewed every year by major brewers in both Canada and the United States. Linked to on the right there is the fact that the Brewers Association no longer recognizes ice beer as a category. And again, it's simply because people weren't entering it into competition, not because it's disappeared from the market. But gathering competition data to prove the legitimacy of a style, I think, is a flawed approach for reasons such as that. There are lots of good reasons why a company may or may not enter their style. And, you know, I agree with the BJCP, as a matter of fact, when they say that it needs to be a thing before the style is recognized, and not because the style is recognized. Like a good dictionary, they should probably be descriptive, not proscriptive. Describe how people actually brew, not how a minority wishes they would brew. or use the English language. But there is, however, that undeniable feedback loop, and the BJCP recognizes it themselves. Of course, that's what they mean when they say that they want to recognize the fire, not start the fire, right? But recognition provides oxygen. Yes, it's not a substitute for raw fuel, and it's no substitute for the ignition, but still, starved of oxygen, any fire will eventually die out. And that's the missing part for these styles. Full disclosure, I am, of course, a passionate Canadian brewery, and I'm also employed by the Canadian Food and Wine Institute, and I absolutely want to celebrate these styles. I would consider their addition to the BJCP a triumph for Canadian brewing culture. I do want to see them recognized, but as we're about to go through them quickly, I can assure you that I did my absolute level best when composing these draft style guidelines to be faithful to how they actually exist out there in the world, at least at the time of writing. And I certainly did not invent these styles out of whole cloth. That said, the longer they do go unrecognized, whether here or abroad, the less strong the case becomes for official recognition from the BJCP or anyone, and the more likely that these little fires die out. At the time of writing, I do still believe it's fair to say that these styles are things all on their own. But let's take a look, and you can tell me yourself what you think. Ontario Pale Ale usually is described as somewhere between American and English, characterized by a use of crystal malts, especially dark crystal malts that have become wildly unfashionable at a time when many brewers are pulling any crystal out of their IPAs. This beer can sometimes read as nostalgic at best or old-fashioned at worst. Crystal malts provide much of the color and flavor for which this style is known, but caramel maltiness should remain reasonably balanced. It can sometimes clash when you're dealing with C-type, if people still use that term, hop character. Sessionability is important to the style. Excellent clarity, citrusy, piney aromatics, moderately fruity ester profile. You've had an Ontario Pale Ale, I imagine, maybe not for those of us who are joining across the country. I think it's, in terms of style comparison, almost like an American strong ale. If you've had an Arrogant Bastard recently, it hasn't aged super well in a lot of respects, but it's also got that heavy dark crystal malt and C-type hop character, striking a kind of an older fashioned balance. This is like an American strong ale turned way down in volume. Some producers used to somewhat cheekily describe it as a politer version of a American ale. In terms of history, this is a modern craft beer style originating in the Southern Ontario region of Canada. Mill Street's Tank House, first released in 2003. Wow, pardon me. Is felt to be by most to be the prototypical example and was the inspiration for many other examples that followed. The style grew meteorically in popularity through the early 2000s until it became a victim of its own success as local beer critics and beer fans became rather hostile to what was now a commonplace and uninspiring style. But this beer, for brewers of a certain era, is still a touchstone beer. In any case, at the same time, a lot of breweries were launching that chose an OPA type beer as their flagship, including quite a few contract breweries, which were at the time quite controversial in Ontario, still controversial, but even more so at the time. Perhaps as a result of this negative backlash, few commercial breweries will use this term, even Mill Street preferring to describe their tank house as a Canadian pale ale. And yes, It's not truly a Canada-wide phenomenon. In fact, you could almost call it a Toronto Pale Ale. It would be even more despised then. But Ontario Pale Ale was the descriptor I went with. We're talking Mill Streak's Tank House, Duggan's number 9, at least the old. Both of these have been reformulated relatively recently and no longer have that kind of dated profile of heavy crystal malt. Junctions, Conductors, Kensington's Augusta Ale, Hogsback, Great Lakes Pompassass somewhat, Collingwood Downhill, Old Tomorrow Canadian Pale Ale. Again, that Canadian Pale Ale, not truly a national style. And yes, always the curmudgeon, local beer reviewer, the Ontario Pale Ale, and why I hate it. At least he's acknowledging that it is a thing. Again, a lot of the arguments against Ontario Pale Ale is A, it doesn't exist, B, I hate it. It's like saying ghosts don't exist, and I wish they'd stop waking me up. Quebecois Rousse, also a Canadian Pale Ale, a lot of similarities to Irish Red, characterized by use of roasted malts, roasted barley, which can provide a lot of that unique orangey kind of color, more of an orange amber than the rich kind of rufous amber of a red ale made primarily red through crystal malts. Still, that roast character should not overwhelm the profile, and like Irish Red, caramel malt character is welcome. It's become a fairly broad term that can describe beers that strongly resemble Irish Red, American Amber, or something in between. As a result, the use of the term Rousse in the market has expanded to include beers that are anything resembling International Amber to Amber Belgians. And this room for interpretation risks enlarging the style to the point that the term is reduced to a simple color descriptor. Many would argue that has already completed its cycle. Nevertheless, the classic 1980s style is what I am defining here. Again, in terms of profile, it's fairly similar to an Irish Red. Rousse, in terms of comments, is not usually found outside of La Belle Provence, both as a style and as a term. Other French-speaking regions will often use the term ambré or amber when describing red ales. Rousse is not a direct translation of red, which would be rouge, but rather of red head in the feminine, roux being the masculine. And this has established a fairly long-lasting and not unproblematic trend in Quebec of naming beers in this convention, after women and their hair colors, often with very highly sexualized language and imagery. I'm sure you've seen it. It's again a modern craft beer style, originating in the northern Montreal region of Quebec. And again, La Brasure du Nord's Boreal Rousse, launched in 1987, is considered the prototypical example, as well as the first commercial brand to use that term, Rousse. For the brewery's part, they describe its inimitable style as having caramel malt aromas, subtle bitter notes, full mellow taste. That's an Irish Red. Significantly, they use both caramel and roasted malts, with the flavor impact of the latter becoming a significant point of differentiation from other amber ales like the neighboring Ontario Pale Ale. However, this style becomes and remains largely a Quebec-only phenomenon, with the notable exception of Ontario's Lake of Bays. If you remember when they launched in 2010, it was with a flagship that was a Rousse. And they spent several years trying to educate the Ontario market on what a Rousse was. And then they gave up and they rebranded in 2012 to Sparkhouse Ale. It retained its original formulation, which includes both chocolate malt and roast barley. It is still a Rousse, but not a name. Any connection to the style has been cut, and consumers outside Quebec remain unaware of Rousse. However, it remains, at least to my knowledge, at the time of writing anyway, the most popular beer in their portfolio. It's a Rousse, an all but name. Within Quebec, the term is too popular and again has been applied to almost any red beer, with the result that Rus has been thinned to that of a color descriptor in many consumers' minds and is at risk of semantic fatigue from overuse. Suffering from this and from a lack of any formal definition, many breweries today will market and label their Rus additionally as another style, often either an Irish style red or American style red, depending on where it leans in the balance or whatever other style better describes it for the consumer. Boreal, again, is the classic example. And while they don't have a lot of Twitter followers, they still reinforce this connection with the red head. Again, Sleeman is known as Rus in Quebec, dark in Ontario, but if you bought an Ontario bottle and you have seen it, you just might not have noticed or paid attention to the Rus part. Canadian ice beer is a pale lager that has undergone some kind of freezing process, very superficially similar to a German Eisbock. These beers typically, but not always, have a higher alcohol content than the base beer style that is iced, and generally have a low price relative to their alcohol percentage, and as such, they're often associated with intemperate discount drinking, not unlike American malt liquors. And in terms of style comparison, they can be very similar to them. This was a product of the silly season of the beer marketing wars of the 1990s, complete with industrial espionage and counter-espionage. The exact process to this day that various breweries use remains something of a closely guarded secret, and the result is that various explanations of the process exist in the public domain, some more questionable than others. Many claim that the formation of ice crystals is primarily for clarification, not concentration. The idea being that just like CO2 can nucleate out of solution on dirt or any sort of particulate matter, your I don't have one on my glass, but your nucleation etching, right? Similarly, if you have particles in suspension, that also provides a nucleation site for ice crystals to form. So you form an ice crystal around that particle, it becomes larger and easier to separate from the beer. Of course, that process would also concentrate the beer as you're removing frozen ice along with your haze forming materials, whatever they are. Some argue that after the ice crystals are formed, it's allowed to simply remelt back into solution. And in this case, it's not for clarification or concentration, but simply for straight up marketing. And the whole situation's made incredibly muddy by the fact that a lot of these large brewers that make ice beer are also high gravity brewers. What does it mean to ice a beer that you are going to dilute down to a final packaging gravity anyway, right? You've concentrated a concentrated beer a little bit more, but you're going to dilute it down to 6, right? It becomes muddy. Any case, higher alcohol versions are often labeled as super, extra, or maximum, and commonly clock in at the relatively tame 7.5% compared to an Eisbock or something like that. That's nothing to sneeze at, don't get me wrong, but you know, standard strength examples are 5.5 sometimes, only marginally stronger than an uniced version of the same beer. Again, you may have had this experience. I certainly did when I was younger and I forgot a 2-4 in my father's trunk overnight in a snowstorm. And I was quite nervous to retrieve them the next day. Many Canadians claim that they have discovered ice beer themselves, right? You rush out and, you know, discovered you've concentrated your beer. That is a long-standing consumer tradition. In different regions of the country, it's more popular than others, but yeah, you go ice fishing and you freeze your beer. You go ice fishing and you make some Eisbock, right? Ice beer. That long-standing consumer tradition is not the evolutionary origin of the style, nor is Eisbock. This was launched In 1993, when Molson introduced the first ice beer in North America, Molson Ice quickly captured a sizable market share, launching the style category as well as fierce competition for it. Molson Ice was also the first ice beer in the States, where it was imported by Miller, now Molson Coors. Labatt's released their Labatt's Ice just a few months later, but have always claimed that they actually developed their brand and process many months prior, hinting at foul play on Molson's parts. Nevertheless, both products remained very successfully in the market, and just before Christmas of '93, both breweries launched super ice versions just before Christmas, resulting in negative media backlash, covering the style as being associated with underage, overindulgent drinking, and of course that association does last to this day. After the success of Canadian ice beer, American breweries quickly followed suit with their own domestic products. Coors and Anheuser-Busch launched Keystone and Bud Ice in '94. Anheuser-Busch followed up with Busch Ice and Natty Ice, still very popular. In 1995, ice beer was very successful for a few years before the ice began to thin, and many felt that it was going to disappear like a lot of the other odd novelty kind of styles of the '90s, like clear beer. But ice beer has remained a solid product, moving numbers that for the craft beer industry would be quite enviable. Very much resembles regular or imperial versions of American style lagers or light lagers, has no resemblance at all to Eisbach. Extra versions can bear a strong resemblance to many American malt liquors. And for our competition, the same way that Irish Red in the craft era really broadened out the shoulders a bit to allow for more creativity, we didn't require that people enter something that tasted like a clone of Laker Ice. It could be something more interesting like a cream ale or a wheat beer, American wheat that had been iced. If you want to know more about the story, a good book is Loggerheads, which covers a lot of that period of high competition between Molson and Labatt. And again, a lot of these products remain strongly in the market. I don't know if you guys can see that. This is an ice beer that I made for the Niagara College Homebrewing competition in a small corny. Literally just popped it in a chest freezer. Took a couple of times to figure out just the right amount of time to get a good wall of ice on the side and some concentration without freezing my dip tube completely solid. Turned out it was about 5 hours. It was a cream ale made with some rice syrup, and it was pretty good. I was lucky enough that working at the college, I was able to get it tested, so I didn't have to assume my calculations were correct. The base beer was 4.72. The iced version was 5.16. So about a 9% concentration after the ice crystals had been formed. I had mentioned it had taken me more than one try to get that timing right. The first time I froze it almost completely solid. That beer clocked in at almost 18.5% ABV. Called it Victor Freeze after, you know, Batman's villain and my name. It actually tasted pretty good, like a low alcohol beer schnapps. Freeze distillation is essentially the process, right? I see I'm getting close to time. I'm going to go fairly quickly through Spruce Beer. It is Canadian spiced amber ale, powerful evergreen flavors and aroma, and often lightly hopped or hopped strategically to emphasize and enhance the evergreen character. Maybe low to medium high in alcohol content. In terms of history, this is of course strongly associated with the colonial beers that were not really beers. They were molasses with spruce. The original seltzer right? It's not really a beer as we would define it, as it's not grain based. Those, if you want to make one, would be, I think, better suited in the historical category. As for the story, the one that we normally tell, or commonly tell, is of Jacques Cartier and his crew overwintering at Stadacona in 1535, a native village at the present-day site of Quebec City, and with no fruit available, scurvy killed at least a quarter of his men. The Stadaconian Iroquois demonstrated to Cartier how to make a spruce bark tea, which was able to help the French survive. Not always mentioned in the same story was over the same winter, more than 50 Iroquois of the village died from disease believed to have been introduced by the crew. This story is typically cited as the origin of Europeans producing spruce beer in Canada, but if you are a fan of Scandinavian brewing traditions, you'll know that there is a long history of Europeans brewing with spruce that predates any contact with Canada. Any case, the story is always avoiding a simple narrative. History is that way. In any case, the tradition was established, and this was the origin story, the creation myth of spruce beer in Canada. And sure enough, all along the St. Lawrence, there remains to this day scattered traditions of spruce beer manufacturing, especially at home as a low alcohol soft drink, a kind of, again, so old-fashioned, it's actually really hip seltzer. Until the practice kind of fell out of favor in the 60s. During the 80s, kind of interesting because it mirrors what's happening right now in the kombucha industry. If you're not aware, a lot of kombucha, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending on your perspective, hasn't had its alcoholic fermentation properly halted, and so is actually low alcohol. Similarly, in the 80s, a major commercial producer of spruce beer in Quebec, where you can still just go into a grocery store and buy a bottle of spruce beer. It remains a regional taste. Marco was discovered to have roughly the same alcohol content as a light lager. And this caused outrage among parents who had been giving it to their kids to drink. Just wait till parents find out about kombucha. Any case, the company resulted as a result of the controversy, but was revived in the late 1990s. And if we have anyone joining from Quebec, you can get Marco there today. There was an attempt in 2011 to consciously establish a style, do exactly what the BJCP does not want us to do, invent a style, by Mario Dier, who wanted to establish a new provincial style for Quebec in the spruce beer Bière d'Épinette mold, which was Annidale, which required balsam, and that's where the name was derived. Of course, it's also a pun. I need ale. You could enter that. That style was briefly brewed by a few brewers, but did not really ever take off. Yeah, there is, I think, again, it's not limited to Canada, but there is, here's an example of Annidale. There is a, maybe not prominent, but ongoing tradition of spruce beer in this country from its earliest days of colonial contact. And similarly, if you argue that's not enough volume, then I would, talk to you about lambic. And I mean straight, where there's one commercial example in the BJCP, right? For many years, it wasn't something that, but then again, recognition helps. Anyway, moving on. If you're interested in making old-fashioned cool, but also deeply uncool, I love it. I shouldn't be cruel to it. I think it's great. Miss Lillian Williams here from Nova Scotia has her recipe for you of how to make spruce beer. Now, it's mostly balsam, but again, like my style categories, it doesn't strictly have to be made with spruce. It's filtered through a pillowcase. It's sugar. It's not malt-based. This was published in Cape Breton's magazine in 1974. Homebrew, non-alcoholic spruce beer soda. I love the last line here. You learn to like it. And you do. All beer is an acquired taste. Certainly spruce beer is as well. Again, the historical precedent that is usually referenced in a lot of these beers is something like Ben Franklin's recipe for spruce beer, which is a lot of sugar and some spruce. The molasses being used is one reason why brewers like Garrison will add ingredients like that, and again, reference old recipes. One lifetime and mustache ago, I made a commemorative cask for, it would have been 2012 because it was the anniversary of the War of 1812. Made a historic inspired spruce beer cask. And we had a reenactor come help us tap that cask back at Black Oak. That is almost at time, but I would be remiss if I didn't give at least a bit of a mention to this year's featured styles, assuming we get to actually run the competition, if the situation allows us to, very much hoping to, which is Indigenous North American styles, kind of picking up where that colonial narrative left off. In the Canadian styles guidelines, we focused on any spruce beer loosely inspired by that colonial tradition, by that colonial narrative. This year, we looked at the Indigenous side of the story. So instead of the French bière d'épinette or the English spruce beer, we are considering the Ojibwe term for the beverage, which means evergreen bough liquid, but can also act as an umbrella term for beer in general. Forgive my pronunciation for both the French and the Assiniboine, Zingo Babu. And yeah, there are, again, beers being brewed in this mold, embracing Indigenous domestic ingredients, like this beer by Seven Clans Brewery made with chestnuts, or one that I love, The Good Way by Dominion in Ottawa, a sumac IPA. This oyster stout made with oysters from an Indigenous stout, or Indigenous scallop company. And just recently, Allura here in Ontario released Summer Moon, made exclusively with Canadian ingredients. The secondary category that we have is not necessarily defined by the use of Indigenous ingredients, but may very well be. It's more of a exploration of any kind of Indigenous identity. And so again, we have some interesting beers that are made with Indigenous ingredients, but not necessarily. That one is Bow and Arrow's Fringe Jacket Saison. I'm struggling now to remember that special ingredient in the photo. My apologies, it is slipping my mind. And again, The Good Way, Sumac IPA, also qualifies as this category, as would Fancy Dance, New England style IPA. And again, the Allura beer. In any case, that is what I have in terms of what may be a Canadian style. Thank you very much for listening to me, giving me the time to talk about it. And yeah, any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I'd also love to know what you guys think. Every time I bring up the Canadian styles, I hear about other styles in other regions that I wasn't aware of. So are there other styles that you guys would nominate to add to the list? And or would you want to see any of these recognized? Do you think they're worthy of recognition? Are there some that you would not want to see recognized? What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing all of this. It's great. Lots of information there and super fascinating. tried making a red ale for a while, and I just can't seem to nail it. But now I kind of want to make a Roos and see if if I can get it right with that. There's a few questions some people popped in and said in the chat. One, I think it was Gary, had asked if it was possible to get the slide deck shared. So people,
100%.
Okay. We can either post it to the CHA website or potentially email it out to people specifically if they want it. But we can
did I send you the link for it, Mike?
You did, yeah.
Okay, if you could share that, I'd super appreciate it because I am not great at Zoom.
Sure. Yeah, we can. Oh, I don't know if I can share it here in Zoom, but
Me neither.
We'll figure it out. Eric, who had to leave, was he was curious. He had heard people talking about brewing Kronk from Alberta. I've never heard of it, so I can't really give you any more context if you're not on the same page as him.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the interest was inspired by old advertising that was kind of charmingly modern. I mean, if you Google Kronk, you'll see, but it's a spiced beer kind of in the mold of other, what am I struggling to say here? Early sodas, you know how they were kind of sold more as tonics and medicinal products? I have not researched Kronk beyond what's come across my social media or whatever it's called, Krunk or any case. Yeah, I have not had it. Be happy to try it.
Does anybody else have any questions? Brian has a question. Yes. We'll just wait for that to come up, I guess.
Hey, can I just say it versus just like typing it out?
Absolutely. Do it.
I really like the Ontario Pale Ale category. I was just wondering, how do you guys think you would get it in? Because I think it's a really nice, complex style. And I just think in North America or USA or America there, I think everyone is so horny for hops, like overly hopping everything. And that's fine if you like IPAs and pales, but I think the Ontario Pale Ale style, I think it has a lot to offer, right? Do you just think personally what do you think, Victor, how to get it in there, right?
Well, I'm open to suggestions, but again, as I've had these conversations with members of the BJCP, it can be a bit of a frustrating argument because it can be circular in that, you'll say, okay, well, these styles have existed since X. Okay, well, show us the records, and it's like, okay, but it didn't really. It didn't have a defined style, so there aren't entry records. So all I can really say is, I mean, at the end of the day, and I agree with this mandate actually, that the BJCP is not trying to define what beers are legitimate and worthy of attention and worthy of being loved. It's just a byproduct. Yeah. What they're trying to do is facilitate homebrew competitions. So that actually can sometimes be the frustrating answer too, is that, I'm met with the answer, just define them and then share them with your homebrew clubs. Great, I did that, and no one uses them. So that's my number one thing I would suggest, that when they ask me to show proof that these beers continue to be a thing and that their addition to the BJCP would be valuable as they define it, which the purpose of those guidelines is to facilitate homebrew competitions, then we gotta brew them. We got to enter them, and we got to have categories in competitions consistently. So it doesn't have to be me. Anyone can go to the BJCP and say, look, across country, there's a Roos category in every competition.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can recognize it now.
But you know how, like, sorry to interrupt you, but you know how some categories, they'll combine certain categories together?
Mm-hmm.
I know America, they've grabbed the styles and they've just added hops to everything. But like, if you look at like an English pale versus like an American pale, you know what I mean? And then you put a Ontario pale ale in there, they're all similar. Like they could all be categorized together, don't you think? Like, have you?
Oh, totally.
No, I'm just asking, just curious, you know, like, that's all. I'm just thinking if they could get categorized, with each other, then it's kind of more, they're on more like a fair playing field, right? I know every competition is different, right? But
oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, that's also another tricky layer to this, is that even if, you enter an Ontario Pale Ale, it may be judged in a flight of, same with anything, right? The odds of you entering a rarer style and winning a medal for that style are vanishingly small unless it's a huge major competition that has maintained those as distinct style categories. Odds are you win an excellent, let's say, I don't know, what's a rarer style? New Zealand Pilsner. You're not winning a medal for a gold New Zealand Pils, you're winning a medal for like blonde ale.
right.
Right? So nevertheless, being able to point to competition websites that say, yes, we recognize Roos or Ontario Pale Ale or whatever as its own category. So you don't have to go to specialty. You don't have to try and force it in there or put it as an American.
Right.
And then be forced to choose between either not winning a medal or not entering it, like Mill Street clearly has started to do, or bending it more towards the style as defined so you can win a medal, right? So, I mean, yeah, could they all be judged together? Absolutely. Most of the time they probably will be. But I still think that's a fair sight better than putting something like a Tank House in a flight with a super hoppy, juicy American flight, or a nice, earthy, leathery, God, no one makes English IPA anymore. You know, I'd like forget Roos. I'd like an English IPA. But yeah, I digress. The point is, IPA is a great example of how styles change. When I'm in classrooms speaking to younger brewers who are starting out, IPA to me and to the BJCP defines IPA as always being bitter. But to many consumers, the idea of hoppy, not bitter, is established. And IPAs need not be bitter in many consumers' minds to be an IPA, right? And something like the English IPA is, not super popular. Mm-hmm. But I digress.
All right, thanks. No, I just wanted to pick your brain.
Anybody else have any questions? So, Victor, why do they call it an Ontario Pale Ale?
It's a good question, because like a lot of styles that evolved organically through a genuine movement, culture, scene, whatever you want to call it, no one person named this, right? Tank House called it Tank House, the same way that Smithwick's called it ale, right? It took, in the case of Irish Red, it took Michael Jackson to define it. In terms of Ontario Pale Ale, I'm not sure who gave it that moniker, but it kind of stuck, right? Up until it became unpopular. Oh, we don't make an Ontario Pale Ale, we make a Canadian, right? But I mean, whatever you want to call it, it is, I would argue, distinct from either an APA or an English Pale Ale. But again, as time goes on, if you've had a Tank House recently, it's tweaking its formulation. as you know, a lot of brewers always do, to respond to market demands and conditions, right?
Yeah.
Brooklyn Lager was not a pale ale or a India Pale Lager, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, for sure. People gotta stay relevant, I guess.
I mean, I can't give the answer to the question because I wouldn't know who first gave it the moniker, but I would say Ontario, because Toronto Pale Ale doesn't sound great.
Yeah.
And I should say, because I've been making jokes about it, but I love Toronto. I lived in Toronto for some years, but you know, I don't know if you've heard the movie or documentary, Everyone Hates Toronto. We have a thing, maybe not further afield, but at least in the rest of Ontario, where we love to hate Toronto.
Like Nickelback, they're the brunt of the jokes.
Sure, yeah.
But I like Toronto.
Nickelback Pale Ale, that would do well as an export, but not domestically.
No.
Weirdly enough, right?
Yeah.
That's a great point. It's an exception to my theory about how we tend not to really think someone has made it till they made it abroad. Nickelbrook is the exception.
Yeah. Ron here is saying that he likes Canadian Pale Ale versus Ontario Pale Ale.
Fair enough.
I'd probably agree. I mean, unless the Ontario Pale Ale was named that because it was made with Ontario ingredients. But
no, it just emerged. But I mean, even as the style guidelines mentioned, when I was writing them and when I was soliciting feedback from brewers across the country, people mentioned to me that BC had a similar product, just again, example of coevolution, right? So there may be merit for the term Canadian Pale Ale. Again, the key issue as far as official BJCP recognition is not what has historical merit in the past, it's what people are brewing today, unless it was already recognized and unless, I don't know, it's Lambic or Kentucky Common. What, you know, it's, right? How many Kentucky Commons have you had since they were introduced to the guidelines versus the 0 I'm sure you had prior, right? It's, there is that loop.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. In fact, I think it's great that I've had Kentucky Commons and, you know, Dusseldorf Alt.
Brian says, what about combining all these Canadian styles into one category?
That's what we did for the Niagara College Brewing competition. At least the next year we ran it simply because we didn't have enough entries in individual categories anymore to put out a table of flight of just say ice beer, right? So I collapsed them into a Canadian category, but this is at the discretion of competition organizers. And this is another misunderstanding that is common about the BJCP, is that you don't have to use their guidelines. You're absolutely welcome to write your own like I did. And you can, you know, structure your competition however you see fit as long as you follow the protocols. But to date, no other homebrew competition in Canada has, let alone had their own, they're welcome to do it. I would encourage them to do it, have their own flight of Canadian styles. They haven't even incorporated these styles and this language into their competitions. So there's been very little uptake domestically. And again, to be fair to the BJCP, the authors of that document were overwhelmingly Americans writing for an American audience. And how can we expect them to celebrate or even recognize our styles if we don't?
Yeah.
Right? Who's going to champion Ontario Pale Ale? It's not going to be a dude from Kentucky.
No, they don't care.
Yeah. No.
If it's a BJCP sanctioned competition, they can tack on the Canadian, like these styles, and have people submit under them.
Absolutely. You can have whatever style category you want as long as you publish those definitions ahead of time so it's fair to your entrants, right? They understand on what conditions they're being judged. One of my, at least it used to be back in the day, the Hoppy Halloween Challenge, if I can recommend an American competition. I loved it because their feature category was the spooky brew, loosely defined as something that is, super spooky. So it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and yeah, you wanna do that, no problem, right? The BJCP has absolutely no problem with that. In fact, if you are a judge and you've judged our Canadian Brewing Awards or Ontario Brewing Awards, you'll know that they don't use the BJCP guidelines, they use their own. They are BJCP sanctioned, but they use their own guidelines. Okay. Totally kosher, no problem with that. There just has been zero interest, at least to my knowledge, of any other brewer, any other competition formally, they're not going to kick out your entry if you decide to label it a Roos or an Ontario Pale Ale, but they're not saying, hey, this year we're featuring Ontario Pale Ale.
Is there any reason why like competition organizers would not want to include these?
I mean,
lack of interest, knowledge.
I can only speculate. Yeah, I think for ice beer and Ontario Pale Ale, God, they're out of step with the craft beer scene right now, right? They are, I mean, again, putting aside these styles for a moment, just a clear English IPA is hard to come by, right? Or a clear American IPA with a little bit of crystal character. The scene is always shifting, and certainly I think those two are just not styles that set the world on fire right now. In terms of spruce, it never was. And for Roos, I think even more than at the time I wrote it just a few years ago, for so many brewers, Roos doesn't mean a style anymore. It just means red. So what do you mean enter a Roos? It's like saying I have a category for red beer. But I mean, again, end of the day, if these styles aren't adopted or celebrated, it's not the end of the world, but it's certainly, I don't think, going to be adopted and celebrated outside of the country. So if we're not going to do it, then I don't think it's reasonable to accept that other people will say, oh, Ontario Pale Ale, tell me more.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else have any final questions for Victor?
Well, thank you guys for coming on for this talk.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Nice to virtually have a beer and talk about beer again.
For sure. I did share that link.
Awesome.
I forwarded it to my personal email and then posted it in the chat, but we'll also get it because we record the videos and we post them on the CHA website. Get it posted on there as well.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thanks so much.
Have a good evening or day.
Yeah, well, I got another hour or so before.
Okay. All right, take care, everybody.
Okay, thanks so much. Bye, everybody.